So this is a Mac Pro from 2006. Back when I first got this thing, it was quite disgusting. So before using it more extensively, I took the time to take it apart and clean it properly. This thing had like several layers of dust settled on every component. Fuck me. I got a couple of these machines very cheaply, so I decided to keep one to play around with. When I was a kid, I remember seeing these monstrous Power Mac and Mac Pro machines at an office where my dad used to work, and I was very impressed with them, but obviously I never had a machine like that until now. So after cleaning years of gunk, dust, and cigarette smoke off of this thing, I wanted to plug it in and see whether or not it worked. It seemed to power on and work just fine. So I popped in a game disc and admired the glorious loading mechanism.
Nice.
So even though the computer was working very well, I've noticed that the CPU temperatures were quite high. So given that I've chosen to use this computer more extensively, I've decided to open it up again, disassemble it, and change out the thermal paste. So this thing has a monster pair of aluminum copper heatsinks, and the thermal paste underneath them had turned to absolute concrete. So they were very difficult to pop out. Tried rubbing off the thermal paste just using some alcohol, but that wouldn't work. On the heatsinks, I actually resorted to using some sandpaper. After like an hour of scraping, I've applied some special copper impregnated thermal paste to the processors. After reassembling everything, I prayed to God that I haven't broken anything and turned on the computer. Hopefully the computer turned back on, and the result was pretty amazing. The temperature had dropped on average like 10-15 degrees Celsius, which meant that I could continue on using and enjoying this computer. Oh, Jesus. Okay, hopefully my table doesn't crumble under the weight of this freaking monster. So yeah, again, this is a Mac Pro 1.1 from 2006. This thing is a proper successor to the Power Mac lineup, and it's actually in the same case the previous Power Mac was, the Power Mac G5. So for the longest time, the Power Mac lineup, and then later Mac Pro lineup, was not only Apple's most powerful computer, but Apple really liked calling them world's most powerful computers.
Introducing the Power Mac G5, the world's fastest, most powerful personal computer.
And if you're into watching all Apple presentations and commercials and advertisements, you'll come across many ridiculous ads calling this thing like the most powerful computer in the world.
In fact, it's the world's most powerful personal computer, period.
And starting with the Power Mac G4, it was the world's first supercomputer for the home.
For the first time in history, a personal computer has been classified as a weapon by the US government.
But given that the technology moves with such a rapid pace, you might ask, how is this thing even usable in modern day and age? To my surprise, these things are actually moderately useful if you use them for a very specific thing. So now I'm going to show you how I use this thing and why it deserves a place under my main desk as a backup computer. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is just the design and the build quality and weight of this thing. Like, this is a modern case. It's just a random Cooler Master case, and I can hold this case with just my one hand because, yeah, this thing is very light. It's made out of like plastic and sheet metal. This thing is made out of machined aluminum, and it's surprisingly heavy. I can barely lift it with my two hands. So there are a couple of very interesting design choices going on with this computer, and we're gonna start with the way you open it. So if we look at the If you look at the back, this thing has a surprising number of I/O for an Apple computer nowadays. So it has USB ports, it has FireWire ports, which at the time were faster than the USB 2.0 ports this thing has. So it has both a FireWire 400 and FireWire 800. And it also has optical in and out, and it has line in and headphone jack. It also has two LAN ports. This thing has a very high-end graphics card for the time.
Or if you really want the highest in graphics performance, a killer card from NVIDIA, the Quadro FX 4500 as well.
and it also has a third party. I think this is a video monitoring card of some sort, because I think this computer in its past life, I think this thing was actually used as a CCTV server in a local grocery store we have here in my city. So yeah, that's quite interesting. So yeah, this here is a fan, and this is a AC input, and also you have this latch. So the way you open up this computer is you just pull on this latch, and that allows you to pop this cover, and that's it. You're in. So this thing is surprisingly serviceable as an Apple product. If you've ever worked on Apple products from like late 90s up until 2011-12, you'll find that they're very, very serviceable. And that's why you can take these computers from back in the day, and yeah, you can still upgrade them and do cool stuff with them. Okay, so bringing you a bit closer, you can see that down here we have a couple of RAM cards. So this thing is actually very upgradable as far as the RAM is concerned. This bottom card has 6 gigs of RAM installed, which is a very high amount of RAM for 2006, but this upper card is actually empty. So if I wanted to, I can install additional RAM in here, and I think this thing actually takes up to 16 gigs of RAM, which is an insane astronomical amount for 2006. But it's a special kind of server RAM which I don't have on hand, and I don't want to mess with any compatibility, because if you install a crap load of RAM, that means you have to have a 64-bit operating system, and I just don't want to do that for compatibility reasons. Another thing this thing has is an NVIDIA Quadro graphics card, which is, I think at the point that this thing was introduced, this was the highest end graphics card you could have. It's a 512 megabyte graphics card, which, yeah, so this compartment here contains dual Intel Xeon 3.0 gigahertz processors, and as you saw, I've changed the thermal paste. As you can see, the interior is actually quite beautiful because there's no exposed cables, nothing. You just pull out compartments and cards, and it's all very, very neat. But this hardware, as neat as it is, it's very outdated, because this is like DDR2 memory. This graphics card is obviously outdated. So you might wonder, what makes this usable in 2024? And for me, the answer is this. One of the other neat engineering feats of this computer is the hard drive loading trays. Because unlike other computers where you have to screw in the hard drives and then connect them via cables and so on, this thing actually has a neat caddy system implemented. So you just take this caddy, you pull it out, and there's your hard drive. That's pretty neat. So it's hot swappable. The only issue is you have to have these caddies, but if you have them, just take them, pop them in, and that's it. And when I got this machine, it only came with one. So I actually do have some other caddies from another model, a newer model of Mac Pro, and some of them are like first-party ones, and then I have a couple of third-party ones. But issue with them is, Apple being Apple, these caddies from the newer models are not compatible since they have extra stuff in between. They don't want to fit properly. So if you don't have compatible caddies, you're kind of screwed. So I'm going to show you my solution, but you have to promise not to laugh or judge me, okay? Okay, so my fix for the Apple Caddy system is just insert a hard disk drive as you would, and then, yeah, zip tie it on. See? Not going anywhere. And yeah, I know that you probably could get these caddies 3D printed or whatever, but you know how it is with temporary fixes. You fix something temporarily and then it lasts forever. So this is a 2 terabyte hard drive. This is a 1 terabyte hard drive. I have space for one more hard drive here. And then this little thing is actually a 2.5-inch SSD, which contains my operating system. And then these two hard drives are actually used for backing up my files. So let me explain how all of this works. Since I'm not a professional photographer and I'm not a professional content maker, yeah, I don't have like tens or hundreds of terabytes I need to store. So my file sizes are relatively low. So what I do to store them is, like most people, I have these portable hard drives, which are neat and work pretty well, but they're just spinning hard drives, which means they can potentially break. I also have a cloud storage solution via Google Drive, but if you ever tried tried using Google Drive for larger files, you know how long that can take, especially if your network isn't super fast. So having something like a NAS, which is a very tidy and elegant solution, is great for storing your files off-site. The only issue is the NAS solutions can be quite expensive. Like if you want to buy a Synology NAS, like the 4-bay unit, that thing can cost you like hundreds of dollars. And then on top of that, you have to pay for the hard drives themselves. Since I got this thing for basically free, so what happened is I got 2 of these units for very, very cheap. And then I sold off the other unit because I didn't need 2. And I was left with this. And yeah, I figured why not use this thing as someone would use a Synology NAS, because surprisingly this thing is also a 4-bay unit and you can also fit 4 hard drives in there. Okay, they're not going to be as high capacity, but yeah, it's all going to work essentially the same, although it's not as elegant. So this thing isn't actually my primary storage solution, because as well as this thing being used, my hard drives are also used. I got them secondhand for very cheap, and you may think to yourself, how could you do that? How could you rely on secondhand hard drives for backup solution? But the thing is, this entire system is supposed to be redundant. So when I'm backing up my data, I'm going to back it up to my external hard drive, or I'm going to back it up on Google Drive. This thing serves a redundancy function. So in case that one of these fails or whatever, I do have a secondary backup on my Mac Pro server. It's not a full-on server because it's not connected to a network. I don't have this thing running 24/7. So yeah, it's not as elegant as something like a Synology NAS, but it does have, I think, quite a few advantages, because other than being like a makeshift server, this thing actually can perform some other functions, because this thing is a full-on computer which has quite a bit of RAM and a graphics card, so we can do things with it which you don't necessarily can do with other backup solutions. So I'm going to show you how this thing works in practice and what other things I can do with this machine. Okay, so this is my work table where I have my MacBook Pro running on an external monitor. It's actually connected to a dongle I have zip tied to this stand here. And apart from the thing's internal storage, I also have a couple of SD cards sticking out. Those SD cards are mainly used to store my video files offsite, so I don't have to keep them all on my primary hard drive. But yeah, under my desk there's a Mac Pro, and since this monitor has several inputs, I've hooked up the Mac Pro to the same monitor. So MacBook Pro is hooked up via HDMI, and then the Mac Pro is hooked up to the same monitor using the DVI out. So one more thing I have with my Mac Pro are these dongles. So my main keyboard and mouse, they have several modes of connecting, so they're connected to my MacBook Pro using Bluetooth, but then I can switch them to the dongle, and they will connect to my Mac Pro. So when I'm done with my main computer, I can turn on my Mac Pro. And as you can see, I'm dual booting Snow Leopard and Windows XP. So I can choose which operating system I want to boot to. And for the moment, we're going to boot to Snow Leopard here. So this is Mac OS X Snow Leopard, and it's quite a throwback. And I really like this version of Mac OS X because the previous versions didn't support exFAT. If you wanted to format your drives as a FAT format, you would have to use FAT32, which supports a maximum file size of 4 gigs. So this thing actually supports exFAT and large files, which is, yeah, all I need. So I use this thing to back up my existing SD cards and also my external hard drives. But what I also use this thing for is to dump pictures from my iPhone. You might ask, how can this possibly be compatible with the newer iPhones? Apple has this application called Image Capture, and this thing is even available on newer operating systems, I think. I'm currently running macOS 12.6, and that operating system also has this old image capture application. If you've never used this thing, it's really straightforward. You just plug in your iPhone or even your Android phone, and it will get all of your pictures and videos, and you can just import them to any folder you'd like. So yeah, I usually do all of my backups in macOS because that's just something I know how to do, and it's the easiest option for me. But yeah, since we're dual booting Windows XP, that means that this thing can also game. So when I'm done doing all of my server related tasks, I can just restart this thing, and this thing will actually boot by default into Windows XP. So yeah, this thing is actually my go-to Windows XP gaming machine, and that's because it's quite convenient. I already have this thing under my desk plugged in at all times. Believe it or not, this thing is actually a monster XP gaming machine. When I have the time, I really enjoy playing these late 90s and early to mid 2000s era XP games. They hold up really well, which is why I like getting back to them from time to time. They really appealed to me because these were the games I was playing when I was in my teenage years, so I do have a lot of nostalgia and love for them, but I think that they were objectively pretty good. And since this computer and this operating system are capable of running games all the way back from the late 90s to the, early 2010s, I'm really spoiled for choice as far as gaming goes. I can run hundreds of games easily. Many games you can run like maxed out, like Unreal Tournament here. This game runs beautifully on this hardware, and that's evidenced by the frames per second you can see in the top left corner. In fact, most games from the early 2000s run stupidly well on this system, like Call of Duty 2 here, which is a classic from my childhood. This game really had a profound impact on me because when it came out and started being popular, we were just learning about World War II in school, so it really sparked an interest not only in World War II but in history in general. By the way, I don't know if you can tell, but this thing has an internal speaker built in, which is not very good. If I'm gaming, I'm going to be using headphones anyway. The speaker is surprisingly loud, and it's a nice addition. So if you had any doubt about the performance capabilities of this computer, just look at this. Yep, this thing runs Crysis. Now, mind you, it doesn't run Crysis maxed out or anything, but it does run it reasonably well. It does achieve 20 to 30 FPS when running on mid to high graphical settings, but at lower settings, oftentimes it goes beyond 60. Yeah, needless to say that the setup like this would have blown my mind when I was a kid. To be honest, I'm still pretty happy and impressed by this. And it also plays solitaire, so what more could you ask for? Thank you so much for watching. And if you like this video, you might want to consider subscribing. I do videos on old retro hardware, and I'd really appreciate the support. Thank you so much again, and see you next time.